From Christianity Today, you're listening to The Bulletin, a podcast about the events, issues, and people that are shaping our world. I'm Mike Cosper, and with me today is Russell Moore, CT's editor-in-chief. Today we're going to talk about the shooting at Club Q in Colorado Springs. We're going to talk about what's going on in Iran, and a little bit about Thanksgiving. Plus, today we're introducing a new segment for the podcast featuring CT's own Daniel Silliman. It's called Hey Daniel, What's Weird? And this week, it's pumpkin pie. So stay with us. All right, so Russell, welcome to the show. Good to see you.
Hey, Mike.
Hey, so last Saturday night in Colorado Springs, there was a horrific shooting at a nightclub called Club Q. Gunman enters the club, opens fire. In less than a minute, he kills 5 people. He injures 18. He was subdued by an Army veteran, a man named Richard Fierro, who ran towards the gunfire, as our military vets are trained to do, tackles the guy and, manages to stop the violence. I said this actually before we started rolling tape. This story has every hot button culture war issue in it, and it's a horrible tragedy, and it's also immediately become the center of culture war fights about guns, about LGBTQ stuff, drag queens, masculinity. Where do we even begin to make sense of this story?
And sanctuary cities, because the red flag gun law that was in place in Colorado, apparently El Paso County said we're a sanctuary city for guns, sanctuary area for guns, and we're not going to enforce those laws sometime before. So you have even that included here. You're right. All of that is there. And there's a couple of things that stand out to me with this. One of them is, I think, similar to what we talked about last week, there's a sign of how America is broken and breaking in the way that this has become almost normalized to us. There's not a sense of, with this kind of horrific murder, there's not a sense of shock. There's almost a sense that we've become kind of accustomed to this. And there'll be a few days of debates about various things, and then it just goes away until the next one. And I think that's really dangerous. And then if we look at the sort of rhetoric that's coming out of this shooting, it reminds me a lot of what we saw, a month ago with the attack on Paul Pelosi, Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House's husband, in which the response was a lot of cynical laughter and jokes and so forth. Here you have this horrific shooting, and immediately you have some figures, including some of the figures who did the Pizzagate kinds of conspiracy theories and so forth, talking about, what do you expect? And you have this repeating of this language of groomers and so forth that really does, I think, show the hardness in a segment of American life that doesn't even have that basic human, much less Christian understanding. People made in the image of God were murdered here in front of us, and we just continue on with the theatrical culture war stuff. I mean, do you think I'm seeing that correctly? Is it just it just weighs on me the kind of burned over sort of feel that we have in America with this? Yeah.
No, I totally agree. And I think, you hate the both sides any issue like this. Mm-hmm. But the same thing is happening where, the people who are on the other side of the people who are, the groomer, the ones accusing others of being groomers.
Yeah.
You have progressives who are saying, well, this is what this kind of rhetoric gets you, or sort of lumping together the hateful rhetoric of the anti-groomer kind of activists with any parent, anyone involved politically, socially, or whatever, who thinks that having certain books in libraries are a problem, or the drag queen story hour isn't a great thing for your public school, and so you saw, I noticed just as much rhetoric from the left coming in and saying, well, this is what your hateful, traditional Christian ideology, anti-trans, homophobic rhetoric gets you. Of course, this is going to happen. And it seems to me that the fundamental sickness in our culture is much more about violence itself, right? There's something deeply violent, deeply reactive about the times that we live in. We're so polarized that there's not an event or a conflict or a conversation that doesn't go to 11 like that. And so what isn't surprising to me is that any social issue becomes the center of a violent attack. Because the rhetoric is so heated. The tragedy is that the rhetoric itself has dehumanized people across all ends of the spectrum. The rhetoric's dehumanizing just by the nature of the way we communicate these days.
Yeah, but I think that there is a problem with the rhetoric on our side, and a major problem. And here's what it is. How can we blame people for conflating historic Christian sexual ethic orthodoxy when they don't really know much about it with the kind of language that is used that often is just lying, bearing false witness against people? To say that your LGBTQ neighbor is a groomer, using this, that really the people saying it don't even believe. It's just a useful kind of rhetorical tool. And so if you're looking into this and you're seeing this and you see the church kind of merged into it, if by nothing else than just by acquiescence, then of course you would conclude, well, that's what they think, and it's not true. They're sort of demonizing a group of people on the basis of something that's just useful. It's not what the Bible teaches. The Bible teaches a vision of sexual ethics and of marriage that is in fact one flesh union of one man and one woman, pointing to the mystery of Christ in the church. It presents that as something good and beautiful and addresses that to all of us as broken people. And when that turns into something else, and so you have the rhetoric, for instance. I mean, there are all kinds of really serious questions around gender ideology. That becomes completely meaningless when you have people talking about kids are all over the country identifying as cats and using kitty litter, which is not true. And so, I mean, part of what Jesus was able to do in his encounters with people is he tells them the truth in order to say, I see you, I know who you are. To the Samaritan woman, go get your husband and come here. And if you look at the way that the Bible teaches, I mean, even Romans 1 comes in and says, here's what's going on in the pagan nations on the outside, knowing that there'd be a segment that would say, yeah, isn't that terrible? Then turns around, and here's what's going on with you. And then it goes to Romans 3, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And when we lose that, and instead people become just culture war rhetorical fodder, and you add that to the kind of accelerating political violence that we have, that's it's a broken situation.
Yeah. No, I entirely agree with that. And I think part of, one of the elements of this story that I thought was fascinating, there were, as soon as the gentleman that stopped the shooter, his name was Richard Fierro, and as soon as his story came out, I saw on Twitter several people saying, oh, well, connecting it to like the war on men, and saying, well, look, here's what a real man showed up and saved the day, and this is why we need masculinity, and et cetera, et cetera. All of which I would, and generally speaking, yeah, this was great. This was courage. This was bravery. That version of the narrative, though, falls apart when you listen to him tell the story. Yeah. And he says, yeah, I tackled the guy. And it really helped out that a drag queen was stomping on his head in her high heels. It's like reality always kind of breaks up our stereotypes and these sort of ideological tropes that we want to rely on.
And he flips from being a hero in that kind of a narrative to a villain, because very soon on it becomes, well, what was he doing there? You know? Right. And so it's almost as though in any of these situations, everybody just becomes kind of cartoon characters instead of real people who are suffering.
Right. How do you think we've come to a place where this kind of mass shooting is so normal? It's so daily. I mean, I believe it was just last night, there was another mass shooting, Chesapeake, Virginia. Yeah. 6 dead, 4 wounded. They happen so often, they're hardly news anymore. And, you and I growing up when we were probably in our early 20s for you, and I was a little younger, when Columbine happened, it was stunning. Everything stopped for months to talk about that story. And now these kinds of things happen all the time. What makes sense of that for me?
I think part of it is a giving up on the possibility of changing it. So I think that for a long time when these things would happen, people would say, okay, let's sober up and let's figure out, are there things that we can do? And then eventually, I mean, I think about not just Columbine, but think about Sandy Hook in 2012. There were a lot of people who were saying, okay, well, we're going to come together now as a country and figure out how to make this, if not impossible, less likely. And I think over time, people start to realize we don't even know what to do. That's possible. That's not just utopian. I mean, you'll always have people who will say, well, if you have armed guards in every school, I guess every nightclub and every church, then that will stop this. That's not going to happen. And some people will say, well, if you just had like Australia and the government's buying back all the guns, then that will stop it. That's not going to happen either. For good or for ill in the United States. And so I think a lot of people have just sort of said, well, what can you do? And that I think leads to the wrong sort of frustration that just leads us to eventually say, well, thoughts and prayers, but what can you do, and move on? I mean, do you see that? It just seems like there's not even the sorts of, you talked about the culture war arguments. I don't even see the same sorts of arguments about, okay, background checks, gun control, no gun control, Second Amendment. Those sorts of things are almost foregrounded now in favor of all these other things, don't you think?
I think so. I mean, I do feel like I still hear a lot of the same return to, banning assault rifles and ban the AR-15 and, those. I hear a lot of that.
But not from people who really expect it to be done. Right. There's a lot of, I think, lamenting that we can't do that. But you're not having the same thing that you would have with even whatever somebody thinks of Manchin Toomey. Joe Manchin and Pat Toomey came together after one of the shootings, and there have been so many, I don't even remember which one, maybe Sandy Hook, for a background check bill. And everybody thought, well, we can do that. Now... It's not even that sort of thing is not even on the table to be discussed. Nobody expects anything to be done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's true, and I wonder to what extent the rhetoric has just drowned out the possibility, like the ability for us to even imagine something different. I mean, I remember seeing a number recently. I think it was there's something like 30 million AR-15s in circulation in the United States. And so when you hear the rhetoric of ban the assault rifles, take them away or whatever it is, for me personally, part of the reason I feel a little numb to that is I think, well, how on earth are you going to do that?
Right.
You can stop selling them, but there's 30 million of them for a crazy person to go find and buy.
Yeah.
I do wonder, I should say, how much technology is playing into the expansion of the phenomenon, simply in the fact that you have all of these venues now online where people who would, for sad and sick and horrible reasons, want to glorify these shooters, want to see them as, want to see themselves as kind of some weird anti-hero and some weird drama.
Mm-hmm.
And there are websites, chat forums, these dark places online to play into that fantasy.
Yes.
Does that amplify it? I mean, there was another story that I read yesterday about two men who were arrested planning. I believe it was an attack. It was an anti-Semitic attack of some sort. They were arrested in New York City. One of them was the Jewish grandson of a Holocaust survivor who was radicalized online into this anti-Semitic rhetoric. And I just wonder how much is that playing into the speed of the radicalization. But again, that opens up the same kind of despair to me that the gun question does, because, okay, well, the problem is these online chat forums and radicalizing there. Well, how do you start to solve that? And then you get into all the weirdness with free speech and who decides what's hate speech and what isn't. And the problem just continues to feel overwhelming.
Yeah, I think about all the time a letter to the editor, I think it was the New York Times several years ago. A friend of mine had written a book, Ben Sass had written this book on the loneliness epidemic. And there was a sociologist or psychologist who wrote in and said, it's actually not loneliness. He said, we have this idea that these shooters are loners, that they're disconnected from community. And that's true. But the second piece of it is, if that's all you have are just isolated loners, you don't have this sort of thing. What has to happen is they find a pseudo community, usually online, and are radicalized by that. So it is the loneliness that drives people to this. And then part of what happens in all of these radical communities is these people accept me, these people receive me. I have to prove my loyalty. And the way I prove my loyalty is by buying into all of the extremist rhetoric and repeating that back. And it becomes a really dangerous situation. And then you add to that, I mean, I look at this and I see some of the rhetoric that's coming out of it. And I think about a situation that really has nothing to do with shootings, but it's about the way that we in the church deal with these issues, especially those of us who do hold to a historic, traditional Christian sexual ethic, but who don't hate our LGBTQ neighbors or anybody else in our mission field out there. There are just, I see a lot of parents who are in this situation where they have maybe a gay or lesbian daughter or son, and they're kind of torn because if they have a normal human relationship with their child, they feel like they're selling out Jesus. If they don't, they feel like they're selling out their child, and they're in a situation that we don't have when we're talking about premarital sex or any number of other things that fall short of a Christian sexual ethic. And people are in this situation where the rhetoric is so different, is so heightened, that there are a lot of people that are just at a point of despair, or ready to walk away from biblical convictions, or to mistreat their children. I mean, I was teaching at a secular university, and this atheist lesbian young woman came to see me. I thought she wanted to argue about these issues. And she said, my parents have become evangelical Christians, and you're the only evangelical Christian that I know. And so I'm wondering if you can give me some tips as to how to relate better to my parents and how to make sure that I don't accidentally offend them or step on a minefield. And I just stopped and said, do you realize how rare this conversation is that we're having right now? How sadly rare this is. And it would make a huge difference if it happened more from us as well as to us.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. And the other thing, when you frame it that way as well, the other thing I think about is how desperately needed and how much opportunity the church really could, like what a role the church could play in this situation if it understood itself as a community that was meant to look for those lonely, isolated people without a sense of belonging. You look at who makes up the church in the first century, and this sort of wildly scattered community of barbarians, Scythians, Romans, Jews, temple prostitutes that are all converted, rich and poor. Our churches tend to be pretty monocultured.
Yeah.
They tend to be, evangelical churches often tend to be pretty middle class in a lot of places. I wonder, when you think about, Hannah Arendt always used the language of mass loneliness being kind of the root of both how people are susceptible to totalitarian domination and how they're susceptible to radicalization of all kinds. And that makes perfect sense to me in these circumstances.
Yeah.
Well, the heart of that kind of loneliness is rootlessness. You don't have a sense of identity. You don't know who you are. You don't know where you belong. And the church has a story and a place for people. But, I think because we've tied ourselves so tightly to other sort of cultural markers and identifiers, it's hard for me to see a pathway for a lot of people who are on the margins, finding their way into a sense of belonging in the church.
Except when you do see it, it's so beautiful. I mean, I remember I used to kind of take shots every once in a while, even though I love Tom T. Hall, songwriter, singer, but I would take shots at the song Me and Jesus. Me and Jesus got our own thing going. We don't need anybody to tell us what it's all about. I would kind of use that as an illustration of American individualism until I was doing some ministry in a homeless shelter in Louisville when we lived there. And it was a night where they were going to let people call out what hymn they wanted to sing that night. And the director of the program said, "Oh, well, that means it's Me and Jesus." And I said, "Tom T. Hall's Me and Jesus?" And he said, "Oh, yeah." They said, "That's exactly what they'll ask for." And they did. And as soon as they started singing that, everybody, it was just a feeling of intensity. And I started to realize, oh, wait a minute. That's actually what this song is about. These are people who feel like they wouldn't be accepted in the respectable church in their communities. They wouldn't be able to go home to their parents or their brothers and sisters, but Jesus will receive them. And so you had this song that's like kind of about individualism, creating community here in this place. And I've never seen the song the same since. And I think when you see those churches where that starts to happen, where you have kind of middle-class people bearing the burdens of people who are just coming out of prison, or people who don't have a place to live, or people whose parents have rejected them, I mean, there's just a beautiful embodiment of what the gospel actually is in those moments.
Okay, Russell, so we are a few days into the World Cup of soccer. I'm not a soccer fan.
Nor am I.
I don't hate soccer. I just fall asleep when I try to watch soccer.
Yeah.
So I am a Ted Lasso fan, though, so that gets me like halfway there.
Yeah, that's
So, but there was a video that went around this week that was really, to me, was really quite stunning. And it was the Iranian national soccer team before a game. The national anthem was played, and the tradition is that you sing the anthem, and the team did not sing. And it was, it was a stunning moment because it was as clear an act of protest. To me, it reminded me actually of I believe it was the 1968 games when the two sprinters from America, raised a fist from the platform after winning medals to oppose their own country's injustices. And for Iranian nationals to do this in a country with an authoritarian regime that regularly jails and executes dissidents, the degree of bravery and courage that it took, it was just jaw-dropping to me.
Yeah.
Around the same time, the women's national basketball team of Iran had a photo taken in which none of them were wearing hijabs as well. Mm-hmm. And, this comes after, a couple months now of violent protests throughout Iran, peaceful protests on the part of the protesters, but violence from the government against the protesters in the aftermath of a young woman being killed. So just to give a little bit of the context, this began on September 16th. The woman's name was Mahsa Amini, also known as Gina Amini. She was arrested by the Iranian National Police, the morality police, because she was not wearing a hijab and her pants were too tight. According to the government, she had a heart attack while she was in jail and she fell into a coma and then later died in the hospital. But witnesses say that she was violently beaten, and then medical records were subsequently leaked that showed a brain hemorrhage from having been beaten. Somewhere between 300 and 400 people have been killed. More than 15,000 people have been arrested. A few days ago, protesters burned down the childhood home of the Ayatollah. This is big. I mean, this regime has been around for more than 40 years now. About every 10 years since 1999, there's been some kind of major protest. Student protests in 99, the Green Movement protests in 2009, student protests in 2019. But this, to me, as someone I've watched this pretty closely over the years, this feels different to me. Does it feel that way to you as well?
Yeah, it gave me chills in a good way, because we just talked about ugliness and beauty, and I think about the beauty in this really in a couple ways. And one of them is there's such a patriotic component to this, which sounds kind of odd because it's people refusing to sing their national anthem, but they're refusing to sing their national anthem because they love their country and because they love the people who are being oppressed there and are willing to stand up for them. That was beautiful. It reminded me a little bit of after September 11th, when at Buckingham Palace they played the Star-Spangled Banner. And it was just this solidarity with people in the United States. It was beautiful. And this was too. And then secondly, just the individual courage that it takes. I mean, this is not online virtue signaling. These are people who very easily could lose their lives for this action in front of the world, especially because authoritarians hate to be humiliated. And this was humiliating to them. And so it took a lot of courage. It reminds me of, I was just talking the other day with a Christian man who grew up in Hong Kong. And he was talking about the effect that Tiananmen Square had on him when that single protester was standing in front of those tanks. And he saw that and it shook him. And just changed his entire life. And you think he wouldn't even have noticed Tiananmen Square and all of those things if it hadn't been for that brave one guy. And I think it's impossible to predict the ripples that are going to come out for people in Iran who are going to say, we don't have to live this way. And there's something I think there's something particularly powerful, and we saw this in the American Civil Rights Movement in some key moments of Joe Louis and Jackie Robinson, and you mentioned the Olympic athletes in '68. There's these key moments where sports figures really are, as much as people complain about politicization and legitimately in many cases of sports, there are moments when sports figures are able to connect with people and say, we're not just athletes, we're human beings and we're citizens. And I think that can have amazing implications in the future.
I do too. I think it points as well. Let me back up actually. I do too. I think part of what's fascinating about this particular example is the unique role that Iran plays in global politics. It's this small country, punches way above its weight class in terms of influence and, because of its strategic, its geostrategic location, its oil reserves, and all the rest. But it also is unique in, it's, people debate whether you would call it an authoritarian or a totalitarian government. Whatever the case is, it is, for the most part, it's a first world culture with a, with a theocratic, domineering government that lives on the world stage in a way that cultures, either cultures that are first world in that way, that's rare for countries that are first world in that sense. And for countries that are sort of theocratically dominated, they tend to not be players, not have that kind of impact on the scene. And so for it, to me, that it's a story that like, it just keeps confronting the rest of the world. It's hard to look away from it because it is modern, because these are people who look like us. They live like us. And yet their speech and their behavior is policed at a level that I think for most of us is unimaginable. To me, it was one of those moments again where I just thought about, I thought about the phrase, this idea of speech being violence. This is something you hear a lot in our culture wars over here. What it reminds me of is that like speech isn't violence, but it's powerful in my perspective, because that's an act of speech, right? That's a moment of speech, that it's a moment of expression that has an enormous level of influence, as you describe what it's going to do to Iranians who witness that. Well,
yeah, and not just speech, but the lack of speech,
right?
In this case, which reminds me of Václav Havel wrote that famous essay, Czech dissident, who was talking about what happens when a grocer just takes down the requisite sign that everybody's supposed to have in their store, "Workers of the world unite," just to show we're okay with our communist government. When one grocer takes that down, what that does to everybody else, or even just changes it a little bit to add a question mark to the end of it, what does that do? And so this refusal, even when it's I'm not offering speech against the tyranny, but I'm just refusing to live out the lie. That causes a lot of other people to stop and say, wait a minute, there's a different way. There's a different way to live. And that's powerful.
It is. I mean, so much of what makes really any kind of domineering system, whether it's a cult or an authoritarian government, what makes them live is this artifice they create of a world where there's an explanation for everything, there's power for everything, and if you do anything, to push against the grain of the community that you were a part of, you're going to be crushed for it. The courage to do it anyway, which is, those are the acts that start any revolution, any transformation. The courage to do it anyway is beautiful and worth celebrating wherever you see it.
And that's where, I think of Elijah often in 1 Kings, when Elijah defies the king, Ahab and Jezebel, and his response is to say to God, I'm the only one left. I'm only here. And God says, there are 7,000 people you don't even know about right now. And in all of these acts of courage, that's what happens, is you have people who think, I'm by myself, I'm walking out into the unknown, and I'm going to be a pariah. I'm going to be gone. That person who says this cult is wrong, or this situation is oppressive. Then you find, well, actually, there are a lot of people out there that the same thing is happening. And that may well be what happens. I really believe we'll see a free Iran in our lifetime, and it will be because of things like this.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things I heard over and over and over again while we were producing and releasing episodes of the Mars Hill podcast was people saying, oh my gosh, felt like I was crazy.
Yeah.
For all these years, I felt like I was crazy. I was in a similar system. I was in a similar world. And you're made to believe that your own impulse, your longing to be free, so to speak, makes you the outlier and the weirdo. But again, it's the courage of someone to say something or to not say something can make a tremendous difference.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, that gets me to our last topic for today. We're recording this on Wednesday before Thanksgiving. This is probably going to drop either late today or first thing in the morning tomorrow. So hopefully if you're listening to this, maybe you're listening while you're roasting your turkey, mashing your potatoes. Thanksgiving is, I love Thanksgiving. It's one of my favorite holidays. And it's been interesting in my lifetime to watch the evolution of the way we talk about it and the way we think about Thanksgiving. Because over the years, there's been a greater and greater degree of sensitivity about what sort of the American story and the American legacy means, not just for middle class, white Americans like you and I, but our Black brothers and sisters, indigenous peoples, and how they see the story of the American founding and of these things that we gather to say we're thankful for. And honestly, actually, the two stories we looked at today, interestingly, I think provide some color for that kind of challenge. Because on the one hand, you look at the Q nightclub shooting and all the sort of culture war hot button issues that are ignited around it, whether it's about marginalized people and violence and all the rest. But then you look at the protests in Iran and you see what authoritarianism really looks like, and the violence and the massacres and everything that are happening as we speak in that place. And I think you end up looking at our country and our world and saying, man, it's a complicated legacy, but it's a beautiful thing as well.
Yeah. And as Christians, we ought to have a category for this because it's part of our biblical legacy, our historic legacy of understanding there's a crack in everything, as Leonard Cohen would say. There's brokenness everywhere, and there is grace everywhere and beauty everywhere, and those things coexist together. And so it's kind of like sometimes when somebody grows up and they look back and they realize, oh, wait, my parents, I thought that they had everything together and they knew everything. And now I realize, man, they didn't know what they were doing, or they were doing some bad things that I wouldn't do. What does that mean? Does that mean my whole life's a lie? No, it means you've got some flawed parents and you're flawed. And I think the same thing's true with the country. We look at a flawed country and legacy, and we also see beauty for which we should be grateful.
Yeah, so I find it honestly really disconcerting that we are living in a time where illiberalism is kind of winning the day at both ends of the spectrum. There's this sort of reactive, progressive intolerance of conservatives, and that's not really new. I mean, that's been around for a few decades. I think the part that's more surprising and frankly terrifying is this rising intolerance on the right in the direction of kind of a newly defined Christian nationalism, an ethno-nationalism, even. There's a new book making the rounds that's where the author actually advocates disenfranchisement of women voters. If they're married, their husband's vote is the vote that counts. And this stuff is, it just strikes me as crazy, right? Like we seem to have completely lost sight of what makes Christianity flourish in a liberal society, which is we can live with tolerance and grace for our neighbors. And in the midst of that, the goodness of the gospel proves itself in the fruit of the life of the church. Yeah. Right now, there's an authoritarian regime that's murdering people in the streets and it all started because a woman didn't have her hair covered and her pants were too tight, right? Like this is like the Twitter yoga pants war, come to life in ways that are horrifying. And yet it seems like there's an animating spirit inside a portion of the church in North America. And maybe it's just a loud, super online, very small minority. I think that's probably true.
Yeah.
But that stuff spreads. I mean, and things tend to start small and get big. And it feels like something that needs to be taken seriously.
Yeah, but I don't think it's winning the day. I mean, if you look at, you have this rise of illiberalism happening around the world, and then you have repudiation after repudiation of it once people try it. And in the church, when you look at this, I mean, I told somebody yesterday, we've got a segment of people who don't want to be preachers of the gospel. They feel like they're surrendering to the ministry of being Twitter trolls. And so just saying the most outrageous possible things is the way to build an audience for them. And then there are some more mainstream Christian leaders who are afraid of them. And so they'll give them some platforms. That's not going to win the day. What's important is looking at what's happening in Iran. Why is a theocracy so dangerous? It's because thugs and authoritarians are able to claim the authority of God in order to protect themselves. And that is everywhere deadly. The reason that Christianity is completely incompatible with that is because it's not coerced external conformity. It's not what comes into a person, Jesus says. It's what comes from the inside out. And it's just that this sort of theocracy or Christian nationalism or culture war trolling, that's just a lot easier than transformation by the Holy Spirit. And so there are going to be people who are always going to embrace it. Jesus builds his church.
Yeah. Yeah, totally agree. And I think there's something to be said to me when I look at where American culture is with all of its weirdness and all of its, whether you're talking about the melting pot of different cultures coming together, all the innumerable weird subcultures that people kind of live in and thrive in, some of them bizarre, some of them things that we would find morally objectionable. Whatever it is, it nonetheless seems like a place where a flourishing church that loves its neighbors, that doesn't cling to power, that walks in the image of Jesus, of sacrifice and mercy, has an enormous opportunity and can look really weird and strange, like this place that we live in, and eclectic. And so I feel like that's a source of a lot of gratitude from where I sit as well. Absolutely.
I think that there's this time of year ought to evoke from us a sense of gratitude without idolatry. Of all of these natural relationships, we have a gratitude for this country and for the ability to carry out the mission of the church in this country, which is unique in the entire history of the world. And yet, we see that the church is actually more important than the country. We keep our priorities together. It's a good opportunity to do that.
All right, Russell. So this week we're introducing a new segment to the show. Every few weeks we're going to have this feature, and joining us for it is our own Daniel Silliman, one of CT's news editors. Daniel and I, for the last 2.5 years that we've worked together, I've noticed that he and I share an interest in things religious and cultural and otherwise that are a little odd. And so we've named this segment, Hey Daniel, What's Weird? And we're going to kick it off with a subject that was actually the subject of Daniel's most viral tweet of all time. I looked at it. I forgot to write it down. I looked at it today. Do you remember how many retweets or likes this tweet got, Daniel?
Hey guys. No, I don't remember exactly. It was ridiculous. It was one of those moments where Twitter sort of turned your world sideways for a couple of days. but I haven't looked at it recently.
Right. So the tweet was from Thanksgiving week a couple years ago. It says, "Fact of the day: pumpkin pie became a popular dish during Civil War era celebrations of Thanksgiving because pumpkins were grown on small farms, not plantations, making the pie a symbol of abolitionist virtue." Tell us a little more about that, Daniel.
People just love culture war in a crust, politics with their pie. Yeah, I don't know. It's interesting to see people respond to this sort of obscure historical fact. It's a little bit holiday history, which has its own niche in American history, and a little bit food history, which has a related but separate niche. And yet people just like excuses to eat pumpkin pie. It made them feel virtuous to have another slice. Other people, I had a whole bunch of people who thought I was ruining Thanksgiving by making it woke. But
abolition of slavery is woke.
Yeah, I was trying to bring race into everything. Yeah. But part of the interesting history is that we all have our own experiences of Thanksgiving being politicized or political or just being an argument with your uncle, but it actually started as a political push, right? Thanksgiving, this is true with a lot of American holidays, but Thanksgiving in particular was promoted in the 19th century by New England abolitionists as this celebration of a Christian heritage, appealing to the Puritans. And they're the people who wanted it not just to be an occasional practice or a historical thing, but something that we do every year to celebrate, honestly, a certain type of Christianity and a certain type of vision of the world and a vision of a good America. In response, the people don't know, but the pre-Civil War South, the pro-slavery South, spent a lot of time saying that if you were against slavery, it was because you were a Puritan. That was one of the most common slanders. And they're trying to separate New England Northerners from your Midwest Lutherans and other types of immigrants who might not have felt so fondly about Puritans. But so in that process of the politicization, the political program to promote Thanksgiving as a new national holiday, the idea of making pumpkins a symbol of abolitionism and pie in particular became part of that. This mostly goes to a woman named Sarah Josepha Hale, who is the editor of a woman's magazine and a huge proponent of Thanksgiving, started a letter writing campaign to get Abraham Lincoln to declare a day of Thanksgiving, wrote a novel all about abolitionism. The novel features pumpkin pie apparently quite prominently. I can't say I've read it, but from my understanding, it features a good moment of pumpkin pie. And Hale says that pumpkin pie is an indispensable part of a good and true Yankee Thanksgiving. So there's a whole political history there of pumpkin pie. There's also one other sort of historical cultural artifact. There's a poem from 1842 promoting abolitionism and Thanksgiving. And the last line of the poem is, "Hooray for pumpkin pie."
That really gives me mixed feelings because I'm a descendant of Confederate veterans who is an abolitionist, thinks the abolitionists were right, and would like to signify that, but pumpkin pie is terrible. So I guess I'll just impute all of that to apple cake. And
you should probably eat one slice of pumpkin pie to defy your ancestors and take the right side. Just think of your great-grandparents being angry at you eating pumpkin pie.
I think they're angry enough.
Of all the acts of cultural betrayal, I feel like eating a piece of your not favorite pie is a relatively easy one. Yeah.
Low bar. Okay,
we don't know, by the way, whether we don't think the Puritans ate pumpkin pie. They probably ate pumpkin, though it doesn't come up, but they just ate pumpkin. One historian says they probably ate pumpkin on Thanksgiving, but also the day before and the day after, and it wasn't special. There's the oldest existing pie recipe we have actually dates to 1796. So it wasn't until a bit later that pie became a normal way to use pumpkins.
All right, so I'm going to read a couple of my favorite responses to your tweet, Daniel.
Sure.
The first one was, it says, this is going to be my new answer when someone demands to know what CRT is. It's pumpkin pie, Karen. Okay, it's pumpkin pie. And there's lots of so this one, I'll censor it. It's blank. Yeah. Pumpkin pie is about to be too woke for 3 of my uncles, and I'm going to get me some extra slices. And then, as you can imagine, people can search the tweet. There are plenty of the "why would you racialize Thanksgiving dinner" tweets as well.
It was there to start with. If you celebrate the history, that's the celebration of abolitionism sort of embedded in our, currently mostly depoliticized historical practice. I should say that the historian who's done the most work on that, if people want to actually dig into this, is a woman named Cindy Ott, who has a great book called Pumpkin: The Curious History of an American Icon. Recommended.
Nice. Well, we will link that in our show notes. We will link your tweet, and we will look forward to having you again back on here soon for another episode of Hey Daniel, What's Weird? Russell has made his claim on pumpkin pie being terrible. Do you like pumpkin pie, Daniel?
I really like it the day after. I think that's a great for breakfast the next day. My normal pie preference, though, is something tart. So cherry or lemon or something like that is typically what I go for. But for history, I will eat any kind of pie they need me to eat. That's fine.
There you go. Yeah, I could take it or leave it, to be honest with you. One year I made a pumpkin cheesecake. Now, that was good. But I feel like in honor of abolitionist history, moving forward, I'm going to have a slice of pumpkin pie.
But then have a slice of apple cake. It's just so much better. Just so much better.
Well, thanks for listening today. Thanks for listening to another episode of The Bulletin, and we will see you back here next week. Happy Thanksgiving. The Bulletin is a production of Christianity Today. Executive producer, Eric Petrick. Host and producer, Mike Cosper. Producer, Azrae Phelps. Graphic design, Brian Todd. Social media, Kate Lucky. Director of Operations, Matt Stevens. Music, post-production, and engineering, Dan Phelps. Video producer, John Rowland.